Okay. So if will isn't the future tense, the question is, what is it? And remember at the beginning, I showed you will in a pattern with a bunch of other verbs, right? Will belongs with those other verbs, and it's called a modal verb. And so to talk about this, we have to talk about these two related concepts, mood and modality, right? When we are talking about mood and modality, think of this as parallel to tense and time. In other words, just as tense is a grammatical form that tells you something about time, mood is the grammatical form and modality is the concept. So when we're talking about modality, we're talking about the attitude of the speaker towards the factuality of the assertion, right? So consider these two examples, right? Breaking Point's tests computer security for a living, or Breaking must test computer security for a living, right? Now, what's different about my attitude toward whether or not she actually tests computer security for a living? Certainty versus assumption. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Second one sounds. I mean, there's two ways you can read uh, must here, but as assumption. Like if I say, "Oh, she must test computer security for a living," I'm probably not giving a command. You know, test computer security for a living, or else. What I'm probably meaning by that is what I'm indicating is this is the result of my inference. Like I've gathered facts about her and I'm saying, oh, therefore she must do this. It must be the case that, right? This is a difference in modality, right? The basic one tests, it's simply a factual assertion, right? The other one is the result of a conclusion. So that's what we mean by modality. That concept of, I mean, this is just one example. There's lots of modalities, but um, this is an example of a distinction in this. Like, how is the speaker orienting themselves toward the factuality of the statement that they're making, right? And so mood is just the grammatical system that's used to express this idea. So as tense is to time, mood is to modality, right? Most modality in English is expressed in the verbal system with these so-called modal verbs, which I'll list for you in a minute. But you don't have to have a verb. So think about, I listened to his supposed apology. What additional meaning does the word supposed, which notice is an adjective, what additional meaning does that give to the sentence? Assumes it's false. Yeah, what I'm saying is I don't believe it's an actual apology. Yeah, doubt, something like that. So that's a modality without a mood, right? There's no specific grammar. It's just purely based on the meaning of the word. It's not a grammatical form. It's just something conveyed by the word. Similarly, time, you don't need tense to indicate time. There are lots of time words that have nothing to do with verbs. Consider a word like now or yesterday, right? Things like that. So there's a lot of parallels for this kind of thing. Right? Whoops. Really? Why aren't we going? There, finally. Okay. So what are modal verb? These modal verbs that we're talking about, what do they look like? The first thing about them is, unlike any regular verbs, these do not have a third person singular present tense, right? She plays the piano, but she can play the piano, right? We don't say it's she plays, they play, right? Or I play. But it's not I can, she cans, right? So we do not add the S on these modal verbs, right? They must be followed, most of them have to be followed by the bare infinitive. Notice we can't say he must to work on the project. We have to say he must work on a project. Wants, which is a regular verb, can be followed by to work. And notice also wants is a regular verb. It has the S on the end of it, right? Ought is one exception. Ought is in fact followed by to. He ought to do something, but notice it's not he oughts. So ought follows the first rule there, but not the second. Another characteristic of modal verbs, they have no non-finite forms. There's no infinitive form of can. So you can't use it in any place where you would need either a participle or an infinitive. Robertson was shoulding here tonight. No. Right? The Senate has made ignore its own rules. No. Right? I would like to will take you out to dinner. To will? No. The only way to will work is like to will something into existence. That totally separate meaning of will, which is a regular verb, not a modal auxiliary. Okay. So how does modal verbs and tense relate? Shoulding. Work that comes up a bit in mental health field. Interesting, Bins. Okay. So what do we say about these? These are, because they have no non-finite forms, what we say about them is they have an inherent tense. In other words, they're irregular verb forms, so they don't form tense in the normal way. But given the form, we're just going to say they have these tenses. Okay. And I put them in columns for you here. These are the main modal verbs. There's a handful of others that are much less important. These are the main ones. And some explanation about why they're in each column is appropriate. Now, as we already saw with will and would, that example, the ayafyatla yokut example, illustrated the way that when we said say, scientists say that it will. Notice say is a present tense verb and will goes along with it. It's just obeying a simple sequence of tenses. So once you use one present tense verb, unless you have a good logical reason to switch, you stay in the present tense. You want me to really show off, Bins? I have to quickly look up the word because I always forget the second part, but the name of the super long village in Anglesey, right? Right. I mean, the normal form that the residents call it is Llanfair Pwllgwyngyll, right? But the complete form, right? Llanfer pulchwingl gogerich quindrobl llantysilio gogogoch. They did sort of make it up. Oh yeah, actually, Sintolo, Mike could. What we mentioned, I mentioned Mike could in our very first um, lesson. That double modal construction, is you're absolutely right. There are dialects where you can follow one modal verb with another, right? Yeah, it means nothing. I don't use it either, but might could. That double modal construction is characteristic of certain places in the South of the U.S. Um, where, although well, that's slightly different case, Kiwi. Although that's interesting too. But when you say I might could lend you some money, that's expressing a greater degree of tentativeness than would be conveyed by simply saying I could lend you some money or I might lend you some money, right? Like I might could yeah, nah. Yeah, if you're not from the region, that's not gonna sound right. It's not standard English, but it's regionally specific English. Um, to come back to can, could, will, would, notice the same thing that we saw with will, would applies to can, could. So Alicia presumed, past tense, she could solve the problem, right? That's fair to say, Kiwi, right? Because it's an uncertain situation. Alicia presumed she can solve the problem. Notice that one doesn't quite work. They should celebrate dialects and script. You know where you have to listen to for those sorts of things, Bins, because they often get you often do not see those in scripted shows because the writers aren't familiar enough with the forms to include them. Listen to reality TV, daytime TV, or news reports interviewing people. Maybe a podcast, although podcasts tend to be done more by educated elites. So there's a kind of leveling going on in that, right? But I mean, watch daytime TV, you know, watch Judge Judy. It's scattered around. It's mostly like I think of it as being associated with, say, North Carolina in particular, but I know it's broader than that. But it's southern. It's primarily southern. You will see it in some like African American English in some of the northern cities. Big in Kentucky makes sense. Um, some of you're probably not going to find it on Judge Judy. The problem with those court shows is they bring in people. The way they get people for those is they go to the small claims court in like Long Beach or the LA area and they basically just look up people's cases, and anybody who's interesting to the producers they'll ask, "Hey, do you want to come on our show?" And so what you get is basically a bunch of people from Southern California. Maybe not, so you're hearing Southern California English for most of those courtroom shows because they're largely produced in the LA area. Okay, I mean people aren't always from Southern California, but you're more likely to hear Western U.S. English than anything else. But on things like I don't know, I mean I don't even know what the current shows are, but things like Maury Povich used to be, or Geraldo Rivera, these kinds of sort of shows that are deliberately bringing on people for you to sort of laugh at and look down on. They play up the lower class, working class kind of thing, and so you'll hear a lot of speech features and stuff like that. And you'll also run across it in just interviews on TV stations, right? So, um, yeah, exactly, bins. Exactly. They are often pretty cringe inducing. Shows like Hoarders, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, reality TV is a reasonable place. And once you know what to listen for, some of these things like you might actually have run across it and just kind of dismissed it like as somebody misspoke as opposed to using a form that's like normal in their dialect. Neither my bins, but if you're interested in this kind of stuff, it's a good place to go. So with both can, could, and will, would, we say that they are the can is present tense, can and will are present tense, and part of the reason that we say that is that they are patterned with other present tense verbs. So whenever you have a sequence of tenses, can and will pop up when the other verbs are around it are present tense verbs. Would and could are the past tense equivalents. So they pop up when there are other past tense verbs around it. And remember, we're talking about tense here, not time, right? So saying that will is a present tense verb doesn't mean it refers to present time, right? Typically, will is a marker of future time. But that sequence of tenses is important for those four verbs. For most of the others, these tenses are more of an arbitrary thing, and you should think of them as more historical things than part of the present day language. So consider shall versus should. Now, what's your feeling about shall? You might be saying to yourself, oh, that's really cool. I should use shall, just like I'm going to use amn't. You're a shall sayer. I amn't bins. So if you were taught out of, it's a hoity-toity word. Yeah, Kiwi, that's my um, intuition as well. In certainly in cat, shall has a very formal feeling to it, right? Unless you were taught explicitly a special old-fashioned rule of um, uh, like when to use shall versus will, which was a big thing in the 19th century, but it's pretty dead these days. PG Woodhouse, yeah, he'll use it. But Bertie Wooster is an upper class twat, right? I shall, mother. Yes. Think about when you might use it, like in natural conversation. It does feel kind of formal. It's restricted in many people's speech to somewhat formal requests, right? Shall we dance? Or, kind of, whatever shall I do? Wherever shall I go? That kind of Scarlet, like Scarlett O'Hara nonsense. Yeah, exactly. It has a feeling of something out of another era in most cases, right? Now, historically, shall and should is that's why you're obsessed with it. I cannot watch Gone with the Wind. I mean, or to the extent that I can watch it, I root for the Union soldiers to sack Atlanta. But um I mean, the whole thing is like kind of racist. Well, not kind of racist. It is racist. So, all part of that lost cause narrative of the South that was inflicted upon us. You don't give a shall. So let's think a little bit about shall versus should, right? In most cases, shall is pretty restricted in usage. It feels very formal when you use it, but it's still pretty clearly correct, right? We shall read Jane Austen during the course. I mean, if a professor said that to you, you'd probably think, oh, this person's a bit of a twat, but, whatever. Um, we know that we shall read Jane Austen during the course. So notice again, no present tense verb. We shall. But you wouldn't say we knew that we shall read Jane Austen during the course. That would be fun, Mickey. I would have enjoyed a Jane Austen seminar. Never had time for that kind of thing in grad school. I was too busy with my medieval stuff. Tolkien class, very nice. It was impossible to get into. Look at the door. I imagine a lot of people would want to take that. You know, very nice, very nice beans. Um, the fact that we knew that we shall doesn't work is an indication that shall still has a kind of present tense usage, right? We don't, like I shall read it yesterday. Um, we don't really say that. Now, notice though, you can't make the same distinction for should, because it's correct to say we know that we should read Jane Austen or we knew that we should read Jane Austen. In other words, should, even though historically it is a past tense verb, that's its origins, is no longer participating in the same sequence of tenses that can, could, will, would are still doing to this day, right? In other words, it's broadened its use. It has other functions, and so it's not restricted in the same way. Shall and should are no longer exact present past parallels of one another. Now, I'm curious about your judgment about may and might, which again, at least in a historical sense, are present versus past. How do these two sentences sound to you? They both sound okay? Does one sound problematic? Fight! Language fight! So I deliberately gave an example that is likely to elicit, if any reaction at all, is likely to elicit a stronger sense of what's going on here. So notice again, new past tense verb, right? For those of you who were saying you like might, I'm with you. I knew he may let us down sounds a little bit weird, right? And this is easy to explain if we know that may is a present tense verb and might is a past tense verb. Because then you can simply say consistency of tenses. So I knew he might let us down. They're both in the past tense. That's why it sounds better, is that consistency. The problem with that is, in most contexts, may and might are not directly, like, you can use either one in a lot of cases. There is, you should, by the way, Kiwi, use might on paper, not may, because traditionally, if you want to be like, adhere to those old-fashioned traditional standards of written English, you should use may when the other verbs are present tense and might when the other verbs are past tense. That's one of those old distinctions that's falling by the wayside. And the reason why I asked you, that was an honest question. I expected different people to give me different answers because this distinction in most contexts has broken down, right? But in some, like this kind of subordinate clause, it's still, for at least some speakers, still in operation, right? It doesn't sound literary enough. Interesting. That's the consistent, just being consistent tense-wise is the traditional rule for this. I mean, sometimes people think they're being literary by using whom everywhere, right? Even when it's not appropriate. Or whomst, as people are saying, which is just an invented word, just to try to make yourself even sound even fancier, right? When whom isn't good enough, say whomst. Pattern on amongst. Yeah. Exactly. Whomst. Now, I didn't put an example of this on screen, but let me ask there's one way in which may versus might as a kind of tense thing is still in operation. And this is a broader thing about the way we use modal verbs. What's your intuition tell you about the difference between saying, will you sit down, and would you sit down? Which one, Kiwi? Yep. Would is the mean one. Would you sit down? Will you sit down? Yeah, right. Hey, Raj, how's it going? Um, Will is ordering. Would is sort of asking. Yeah, would is more agency. Yeah, all of these are good, right? Would you sit down? Will you sit down? Right? Would you sit down? Which one's more polite? Right? Would is, I think, pretty much the consensus from what you're all saying in different ways is would is more polite, right? Um, uh, can you open the window versus could you open the window? My intuition, and I hope it matches yours, yeah, could is the more polite, can is the mean one. So what's going on there? This is an interesting use of tense for something other than time. Remember, when we talked about tense, I mentioned that the primary purpose was to mark a distinction in time, but we can use it in other ways. The way I like to think about this is we use the past tense forms of these for politeness. Metaphorically, if it's present, it's like you're in the person's face. Present is close to the person that you're talking to. Past is more distant. So it's kind of like, you know, physical distance when you're talking to somebody, right? If you're too close to them, it gets uncomfortable. All up in your grills. Exactly, Bins. Right. So using the past tense form is a marker of politeness or increased tentativeness, right? Whereas the present tense form is very blunt. The past tense form is indirect. So we're using that distance of time in the past as a metaphor for a kind of social distancing for politeness, right? And may and might have a similar kind of thing. I may go to the store. I might go to the store. Might is more tentative than may. Again, that distance that's going on there. Must and ought, you will notice, are purely present tense verbs. They do not have past tense equivalents. And you can tell this by some examples. She must finish the project 2 days ago. The only way that is grammatical is if you mean 2 days ago in the kind of, um, uh, you know, metaphorical sense of she's overdue and she's got to do it now. So you're saying me reading the more formal version as being mean is more of a psychological issue. Well, you're probably including other stuff in it, right? Like emphasis, like would you sit down? Like the way you emphasize down there, language is all psychological. Yeah, Mickey's right about that. What I would say there is what you're doing is you're applying stress on particular words to indicate that kind of pragmatic irritation that isn't, that's added on. You can always convey extra meaning that goes beyond the sort of basic reading of the sentence with intonation, things like that, right? You automatically assume someone's yelling at you. Yeah. Well, if I added a please in there, like, oh, actually, let's put a please in there. Would you please sit down? Will you please sit down? I mean, it's kind of hard to read the will you please sit down, even with the please in there. Will you please sit down? Will you please shut up? Right? It's like it conveys that irritation, right? Whereas, would you please sit down? That's just a polite request. Please makes it worse. Well, again, read it with default stress, right? Would you please sit down? Like if I hammer one of those words, I'm conveying my irritation, but I'm conveying my irritation with that extra stress. It's not anything inherent about the words that we're talking about, right? All right. I'm gonna throw out some fancy terms for you. We're talking about modal verbs. What do we mean by modality? There's like three basic ones. If you forget the terms for these, that's fine. But I just kind of want to show you the range of meanings that these things have. There's three basic categories of modality that you can shoehorn most modal expressions in English into. Epistemic modality. We're talking about our attitude towards whether something is factual or not, right? Comes from episteme, right? Greek meaning knowledge. You might be familiar with the branch of philosophy that's called epistemology. Hey, Krenzo, welcome. Hope you're not too tired to do some grammar. All right. We're talking about something called modality, which is just ways of expressing the speaker's opinion about, you know, the relationship of what you're saying to a kind of base situation of just a factual expression, right? So I used the examples before: breaking tests, computer security for a living. There's the default, right? Breaking must test, breaking may test. Right? These are okay, Bins. See you in a bit. Stay warm or get yourself warm. Um, so with something like this one, right? Notice like must test we talked about, may test. We're talking about the you know the basic what do I want to say? Um, in okay, let me put it this way. In the simple version, breaking tests computer security, right? It's presenting the knowledge of the occupation. It's the focus is just on what breaking does, right? It's a very simple factual assertion, right? But with breaking must test or breaking may test, we're shifting from the actual like what breaking does to something about what the speaker believes, right? The speaker is emphasizing the tentativeness, that it's a matter of inference in must test, right? Or possibility in may test. Now, will, right? We talked about will and talked about how it had shades of meaning other than simple future marking, right? Alice will be finished with her interview by now. Right? Notice the fact that the speaker has reached a conclusion is pretty prominent here, right? Where I mean, with Rob will arrive on Tuesday, it doesn't highlight the speaker's belief quite as much or nearly as strongly, but in some sense, it still remains a prediction, right? So we still call all of these modal situations, right? All epistemic modality, prediction about a fact, conclusion, an inferred kind of thing. These are all epistemic modality. The second type of modality, again, another fancy Greek derived term, deontic modality. Any of you if you've studied ethics, you might be familiar with deontology. Deon is like duty. So deontology is the branch of ethics that believes that, or the philosophy of ethics that believes that there are certain things that you are simply obligated to do, that you should do, right? So when we're talking about deontic modality, we're talking about this kind of thing, either permission or obligation. There's some agent out there who is either granting you permission to do something or requiring you to do something, right? They must finish the assignment. They are required in the sense of they're required to finish the assignment, right, by Tuesday. He shouldn't obsess about things over which he has no control. So shouldn't, right, is talking about that state of, like requirement, right? Don't do this. You may stay for as long as you desire. Right? Permission. I will note, by the way, you may stay versus you can stay. That is one of those prescriptive nonsense rules. If you were ever chastised for using can in the sense of may here, that was utter nonsense. Right? All of these verbs have multiple shades of meaning. And to try to pretend that you can't use can for permission is simply ridiculous. That's just not the way the language works. The third one, dynamic modality. This is when we're talking. This might seem like it's the same as deontic modality, but the difference is we're talking about the ability to do something without a person giving you permission or telling you what to do. So when we say she can run a marathon in under 3 hours, nobody's giving her permission to do it. We're simply saying she's able to do this. You have a bone to pick with all your elementary teachers. Yeah. Oh yeah, that pisses me off. You may go to the bathroom. That pedantry annoys the fuck out of me. That's grammar Nazism at its worst. So notice jellyfish can deliver a lethal sting. Clearly, nobody is giving them permission in this particular case. This is just ability. Yeah, I don't know. Can you? Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're just being a jerk. You're playing on two different meanings of the word. Um, that's like, I mean, it's just a more irritating version of something like, "Can you make me a sandwich?" Right? Poof, you're a sandwich. I mean, obviously, it's playing on the ambiguity of two different possibilities. Right? Yeah. I mean, the teachers don't know any better. They think that there's only one right way to do it, but they're wrong. Damaging young bladders. Yes, bins. Fair. All right. Just a couple of random points about mood and modality that I wanted to mention because you may have run across these things. Yeah, it's not about Kiwi. There's a lovely book which is about history, not about language, but it has a wonderful title of "Lies My Teacher Told Me." It's basically all about the way that American history textbooks used in like public schools, K through 12 classrooms, um, deliberately obfuscate lots of aspects of American history, from the really basic ones to the more subtle ones. Yeah, you learn history in school, then you learn real history. Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of history is teaching, in the K through 12 textbooks is highly politicized in a way that might not be obvious because it's politicized by conservatives who have this agenda that has been in it's I mean they're pushing for it these days now, but they've always pushed for it. They've always gotten it in their books. Math teachers are right. They lied to you about calculus too. Kappa. You may have heard about this term, a conditional mood. The conditional mood that people sometimes use these verbs like can, could, shall, should. The cake is a lie, Mickey. Calculus is fine. The cake is a lie. Yeah, I believe that there's some dispute as to whether that ever really happened. I don't think it was Kansas. There was the story is of a legislator in Texas, I think, who introduced it, but I don't think there's any really good evidence for that. Although it is true that there's a biblical approximation of pi, which is three. Right? Um, but anyway, that may well be apocryphal. I mean, I've It's been a while since I've read up on that, but I think I remember reading that there's no actual hard evidence that any legislator seriously proposed that. So, new math is stupid and confusing. I like new math. I think it makes sense. Old math is often just a bunch of rote memorization and doesn't show you how the different parts of mathematics are related. And really, at its core, math is about reasoning. Yeah, I mean, new math is something people have been talking about since like the 1950s, so it's not new at all, but it's supposed to be a different way of teaching. They revise math curricula every 10 years or so, but you're set in your ways. Yeah. I do want to mention that traditional grammar books often call the can, could, shall, should, everything except will. They often will call that conditional mood, but there's no particular. It's not really a separate mood like that in English. These modal verbs have lots of different meanings. It's not one grammatical construction. There's also a real conditional construction, which is an if then sort of thing. That's an actual conditional. And so I'm not going to use the term conditional mood. It just confuses things. Right. Long division freaks you out. Yeah. Well, it's not just I mean the the routines that American kids are taught to calculate stuff by hand is certainly not the only algorithms that you can use. And other countries have other routines, different ways of doing it. So you look at those, and they're not new. They've been around forever. They're just a different teaching tradition. So, um, imperative, subjunctive. These are other things, right? Imperative, giving commands, right? Sit down, behave, right? Those kind of things. And the subjunctive are moods. The they're formed out of clause stuff, and we're going to talk about them when we deal with clauses. So I'm kind of mentioning them as moods, but I'm not going to get into them because we got to look at a bunch of other grammar first. Logic programming. Well, look, logic and programming is math, or math is logic. Depends on how you want to look at it. At the end of the day, math is simply a highly formalized way of expressing human reasoning. So, all right. We've talked about tense, we've talked about mood, and now we're going to talk about aspect. So, what's different about the situation in these two sentences? Yep. Music can be expressed mathematically, or math can be expressed musically. Take your choice. We know Walter finished the baking. Okay. Yeah, I suppose that would definitely be a situation there. I mean, I deliberately, the second sentence is a little bit shorter than you would normally see was baking in. No, baked is a verb, Mickey. Notice we can't, if it were an adjective, I mean, baked could be an adjective if you mean high on marijuana, right? So if you said Walter is very baked, then baked would be an adjective, right? But Walter baked the cookies. Baking is a verb. Notice Walter very baked the cookies. If we apply that very test, very doesn't go in front of verbs, right? Right. Is baking something into them cookies. So Bins is definitely on the right track. I don't know if anybody else has some insights about how the situation differs here. Did I miss it? The cookies were baked. Walter was baking. Um, yeah, I mean, you're. I mean, both of those things are correct, but that doesn't really describe what's different about the situation. Are brownies a kind of cookie? I mean, that would be part of it. Definitely, that fact about the baking is true. Bins, not. They're both active. Mickey, I think that's a nice that there's that's another really important quality here, right? One reason why it might be hard to see is we probably wouldn't use the second sentence by itself. We would probably put it in a larger context. Like we might say Walter was baking the cookies while he was getting baked, right? Or Walter was baking the cookies when the cat jumped on the counter. Slice, pan, tin. Yes. Um, so the one way to think about it is when we say Walter baked the cookies, what we're looking at, and oh, actually, before I go there, one important thing to notice here is that the point in time that we're referring to here is the same, right? The cookies are being baked in the past, whether we say Walter baked the cookies or was baking the cookies. Right? What's different here is how we are looking at the internal structure of the action of baking. In other words, when we say Walter baked the cookies, it's like we're looking at the event as it might as well be a point in time, right? We're looking at it from the outside. The internal, like the amount of time it takes, or all of those things, is you know is irrelevant, right? It's just into. But when we're saying Walter was baking the cookies, we're looking at that and an action that has some kind of internal structure, like a starting point and a stopping point, and it typically we would use it relative to some other point in time. The examples that I was using were like Walter was baking the cookies when the cat jumped on the counter, right? So, yes, hey Walter, how's it going? Some baking sentences just for you. Baked, buddy. I mean, shouldn't I have no idea whether Walter. I know Walter bakes. I have no idea if he gets baked or not. And if you do, Walter, you probably shouldn't admit that on stream, just in case. All of Walter's food looks amazing. Did I switch windows? Okay. So what we're looking at with was baking. Hey, Fierce. You've done it legally. Good answer, Walter. Good answer. Now, the construction that we're talking about with was baking is called the progressive. And this is what you were referring to, Kiwi, at the very beginning when I was asking you how many tenses there are in English. And the first thing I want to emphasize is the progressive is not a tense. This is something that is frequently misunderstood. People more or less call everything to do with the verb a tense. But remember, a tense is marking a point in time. There's no distinction between that point in time between baked and was baking, right? So there's no tense distinction. What's different is the internal structure. That internal structure is aspect, right? And just as we have tense and time, right, form and function, we had mood and modality, again, form and function. We also have aspect and aspectuality. And as you might guess, aspect is the form, aspectuality is the meaning, the function, right? So progressive aspect, its main purpose is to show that a situation is in progress, right? Either at a particular moment in time or throughout some extended period of time. So Walter was baking cookies while getting baked, right? Overlapping actions. Now, that progressive is formed by using some form of to be plus that participle, what we're calling the progressive participle, the one that ends in ing. Remember last time I mentioned that, or not last time, 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that it's traditionally called a present participle, but that's a bit of a misleading term because participles don't actually have a tense. They're not present tense. You can't cook anything well baked. Well, okay. Well, good. Good. I have seen. God, there's one chef. You would probably remember the name. There's this one chef I've occasionally seen on TV shows on, like, the Food Network or whatever, who is cooking, who's like getting stoned and cooking. He's kind of a big, heavyset guy. I don't remember his name, but I found that kind of weird the first time I saw it. But some cooks, some chefs clearly do. Now, that progressive aspect, like anytime you see to be in any form plus ing, is a progressive. It combines with the tense. So when I say I am going, notice am is a present tense verb. So we would call that the present progressive. Well, it's good that you can get drunk and cook because, you got to have some wine while you cook, right? Only way you cook is dope you. You flambe a lot when you're drunk. That might be dangerous. Just don't flambe yourself, right? CTG strat for cooking is not a good idea. So yeah, so am going, present progressive. Was going, past progressive, right? We just combine. So you can just look at that first verb and say, okay, is that present or past? And then look at the other stuff that it forms to do it. The thing about progressive aspect is it implies something lasts for a limited amount of time, a temporary state, right? Therefore, you mostly see the progressive with action verbs. So was walking, was baking, is going, all of those are action verbs, right? Now you can use it with a state verb, and then you get a very interesting contrast. What's the difference in meaning between these pairs of sentences? Yes, Bins, can you explain more? Is being is temporary. Yes. Yes. Concreteness, yeah. If I say Matt is temperamental, I'm saying that that is his characteristic personality state. Constant state QE, yes, exactly. Right? Is forever. If I say Matt is being temperamental, he's just in a mood, right? It's a temporary state. Same thing with Edna here. Edna lives in Paris. Paris is her permanent one-off mood. Yes. Aspect, not mood. Yeah, I know. Um, Edna is living in Paris. That's like her temporary home. Like we might say Edna's living in Paris for the summer, right? Something like that that shows us that it's time delimited, right? Um, Normally you cannot do this with a state verb. You know, we're talking about state verbs like am, seems, things like that. You normally can't use the progressive with a state verb where um, it is at least by convention not a temporary state. Yes, it's probably a little early in the morning for him. Or it's the middle of the night for Ike, but um, so hey, these are just facts, Walter. Right? Notice we don't say I am knowing the answer to the question. Right? Even though theoretically you could forget an answer, we don't treat knowledge as a temporary thing, right? You either know it or you don't. So I am knowing doesn't sound right, right? Similarly, her father is having bifocals. No, right? Doesn't work. Ike is being bald. Doesn't work, right? Yeah, the first one, it's not just an ESL sentence, Bins. It's particularly something you encounter a lot in Indian English. And I do mean like subcontinent of India, not Native American. And the reason for that is actually pretty interesting. Hindi has a direct equivalent of the progressive construction, right? So it normally translates immediately and directly from English, from Hindi into English, right? So they can just, it's like it maps perfectly onto what they already know. But different verbs are allowed to take the progressive in Hindi than are in English, and no is an example like this. So so I am knowing blah blah blah, like the Hindi equivalent of that would be perfectly grammatical, right? It's just a straight transference of that first language habit into a second language. Right? Indian English has lots of interesting features. So um now Ike is being bald, right, doesn't work, right? Even though like Ike is shaving his head, right? So in some sense it's a temporary state if we think it through logically. But we don't treat baldness as something that's temporary, right? What about these? They do all work, but what's interesting about yeah, they're all grammatical, but what's going on with the meaning in each of these? They're not being used. They're nouns. Walters, I think, got it right. Notice if I say he's being a child, I do not mean that he is currently a child but will grow up, physically stop being a child, right? What we're meaning is he is acting like a child. Is that temporary state, right? So even though logically childhood is a temporary state that you will grow out of, right? We're not interpreting child literally. We're saying he's acting like a child, right? She is being blonde does not mean she has dyed her hair blonde for the moment, right? It means we are interpreting her behavior as stereotypically associated with the sort of misogynist stereotypes of blonde women, right? Like I'm having a blonde moment, that kind of thing, right? They are being Americans, right? They are nouns. Theoretically, can become adjectives, but none of these are, right? These are all now like being a child. Notice a child. That's a noun phrase. There's nothing adjectival about that. That's this is actually we were just talking about verb phrase. Remember, to be is a linking verb, right? So do you remember what we call the noun phrase after to be? Notice he and a child. Like leave out the is being part that we're focusing on now. But if we just said he is a child, right? Remember, child is not a direct object, right? It's what we call the subject complement because it's pointing back to a child. It's renaming it, right? Not an adjective, still a noun phrase, but it's just attributing a quality, to him. Blonde is an adjective. Americans, notice that pluralizes, that's a noun. It's a noun phrase, right? Even though American by itself is an adjective, right? Um, so, but in that structure after to be, you can use either a noun phrase or an adjective phrase. He is Benjamin Buttoning makes sense to you. Yeah, I mean it would. You can what you're doing there. Remember when you're talking about word formation, they are being you just describe espionage. Yes. I mean, you could use it to mean they are behaving like stereotypical Americans, right? Ugly Americans, that kind of thing. I did like that show, The Americans. That was good. Um, but anyway, Benjamin Buttoning, to go back to that, remember we talked about the process of conversion where you take a name and you turn it into a word that applies to a general term, right? So boycott from Charles Boycott, guy's last name, to boycott something, right, becomes a verb. So to Benjamin Button something, nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, when you do it as a one-off thing, yeah, it feels a little silly, but it's still a valid word formation process, right? To Benjamin Button. Well, yeah, I would. Okay, I was thinking about it going backwards in time, but yeah, to do a Bradbury. Okay, yeah. So progressive is usually used for temporary state, but not always. I mentioned this one. The stream is starting at 6 o'clock. The magic of the Bradbury. Go for it, Bins. I look forward to hearing it. Notice here the stream is starting at 6 o'clock. We're using the present progressive to talk about a future time that is scheduled. This is the exact situation that we were talking about, the difference between I am going to the party versus I will go to the party. All right, Kiwi. Thanks for hanging out. There will be homework in Discord in the morning for you. Notice we can also say, so the stream is starting at 6 o'clock. That's not a stream in progress, right? That's just a future scheduled event. Similarly, if you use it with will, he will be going shopping today, right? This is a matter that we've already decided, right? It's our plan. It's different from will he be going shopping today, where we don't know whether a plan exists or not. Yeah. All right. I should probably. I'm going to go through the perfect. Well, the perfect can get complicated. So I'm just going to give you the basics. We can talk more about it later. I don't want to stretch this stream out for too long. These things always seem to wind up being like 4 hour streams when I have them, when I intend to talk for like 2.5 hours. So we talked about the progressive. The other main thing that's often called an aspect is the perfect. And the perfect is a form that you get with have, plus the so-called past participle, right? So Mark has finished the assignment. Nuala had asked to be included. Notice, again, we have an auxiliary verb, a form of to have rather than to be. And then we have this other verb form, right? The auxiliary verb, notice, has a tense, has or had, present or past. So just as we talked about things being present progressive or past progressive, we can also talk about present perfect, has finished, and past perfect, had asked for it. Now, the perfect is sort of on the borderline between something that is an actual aspect and a secondary tense. And I mention this because if you look at various books, some will call it an aspect, some will call it a tense, and it's a little bit of both, right? So notice she was happy to have completed the project. She is happy to have completed the project. She hopes to have completed the project. In every case here, have completed, right? That's the perfect. But the time reference is past, present, and future in each of those cases, right? And the function of the perfect in every case is to take us one step back in time from wherever we start, right? That particular quality of it makes the fact that it's relative rather than an absolute point in time makes this seem like an aspect, right? Because we're looking at a quality of the action, right? However, unfortunately, in English at least, the perfect form, this perfect form, doesn't map systematically onto any single aspectuality, right? So remember, when we're talking about aspectuality, we're talking about the semantics of how an action is viewed, right? Either something that is, for the progressive, it can be in progress, right? Now, the thing that we want to consider for the perfect is the aspectualities, perfective and imperfective. And here we're getting into something where if you're familiar with like Spanish or French, you're going to see some things that you might have encountered while studying the verb systems there. So when we talk about something being perfective, we're talking about whether or not we can view the action as a complete unit, right? So perfective aspectuality, if it's associated with past time, then it's a completed action. It's perfected. But it doesn't have to be past time. So notice Nixon resigned in 1974. So the action is completed. Fine. I pronounce you husband and wife. The action of pronouncing establishes the marriage, right? It's a whole situation. There's no internal structure to it. I will grade your paper tomorrow. Future time, right? But the situation is a unit, is a whole unit. It's not completed yet, but it's still a whole unit, okay? In contrast, when something is imperfective, we're viewing the situation internally, right? It's, I spend too many hours in my car, right? The spending is, not yet a completed unit, right? He is working as a music teacher. Classic progressive aspectuality, it's imperfective, right? Even as a child, she read analytical philosophy, right? Was that child me? No, I did not read analytical philosophy as a child. I did read War and Peace at like 12, but that's the closest I got to the end of War. The last 50 pages of War and Peace is all pretty, is like philosophy of history. But all right, Santolo, have a good one. Thanks for hanging out. Because I wanted to. Yeah. There was a copy lying around and I was like, I'd been reading longer and longer books and I was like, okay, I'll give it a try. Well, to each his own, Raj, to each his own. So just as I was asking you, what's the difference between Les Mis at the start? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that stuff. I mean, there were definitely lots of parts of War and Peace that I was not really understanding what the hell was going on. Okay, present perfect versus simple past. Notice the difference between I lived in London for 6 months versus I have lived in London for 6 months. What's the difference in meaning between those two? Yep. Which one? Oh, 1 and 2. You're labeling the numbers. Yes. Yeah. That's exactly the distinction here. So notice if we're just thinking about this as a point in time, like a lot of people look at have lived and say, oh, that's past, right? But there's more to it than that, right? It's different from the simple past, even though they overlap conceptually in time. In these two examples, at least, lived is a perfected action. It's completed, right? Have lived is imperfective. It's still ongoing. And so notice I lived in London since 2015 is ungrammatical, right? Because lived tells you the action is completed and since tells you that the action is ongoing, right? Same thing. I have lived in London until 2015. Again, ungrammatical because have lived suggests that it's still going on and until tells you it's over. So there's a conflict in the two halves of the sentence there, right? And notice though that the have part, the perfect part, that present perfect doesn't just apply to ongoing action. In fact, like notice I have read the book. And this is a subtler thing, but think about the difference between I read the book, I read Moby Dick versus I have read Moby Dick. And think about when you might use one or the other. Because in both cases, if I say I've read Moby Dick, that's a completed action. The aspectuality is perfective, right? It's done, it's over, things like that. This one might be subtler, but so I'll just give you the answer because I don't want us to be here for the next 3 hours. Moby Dick half left the building. So you use the present perfect in general when there is some direct connection to the present reference, whatever that might be. So for example, if you say, let's do a book club and let's talk about Moby Dick, I might respond, I'll join you. I've read Moby Dick. And in that case, I might have read Moby Dick 20 years ago, right? Doesn't matter. The actual length of time between when I read it and now isn't the deciding factor. What matters is that the fact of the reading is relevant now. And so it's right. And so what you find is the present perfect is systematically used as a way to refer to past time events in a sequence of present tense verbs, right? You should keep an eye out for this as you read. But if you say, to extend on my Ayafyatla Yokut example, you could say scientists say that the volcano, I'll use the volcano because I flexed enough on that word. The volcano, which has been dormant for decades, will erupt shortly, right? So has, so say present, has present, will present. So you just have this continuous sequence of present tense verbs. Or scientists said that the volcano, which had been dormant, would erupt shortly. So said, past, had, past, would, past, right? Just that consistency in the way it works, right? Now the past perfect, so had left, right, is actually a little bit simpler than the present perfect because we're stepping back in time one hop from the simple past. So if we got two actions in the past and we want to distinguish one from the other in terms of relative time, we can use the past perfect, right? So the customer had left the store before the sales clerk hung up the phone. So hung up is the later of the two actions, right? Simple past. Past perfect, sometimes called the past of the past, gives you that earlier action. Okay. All right. We're getting close to the end. Thank you all for hanging out for this. We've talked about all these different verb forms that we have. Notice that you can stack them together. I appreciate you guys hanging out. And those of you who are just lurking, I appreciate that too. Notice, we've been talking about these as one auxiliary verb plus the main verb, to create things. But you can stack them. So Janet has been writing a letter to her grandmother, right? So what we're doing is has creates the perfect, right? Has been is the past participle, right? And then be, a form of be plus the ing form, creates the progressive. So we can read off the forms here. We start with the tense and then we read everything off in order. So has been writing is a present perfect progressive, right? And the combined meaning is simply both the perfect and the progressive together. There's no weird special combination that has a totally different meaning. It's just the meaning of the perfect plus the meaning of the progressive, right? May have seen. So may, we have a modal verb, right? Have, we have the perfect. So we have may, present. So present, perfect, modal construction, right? You should have been studying. Should, modal verb, right? Past tense. Have, perfect, been, progressive. So we've got all of those, stacking on together, right? Now, traditionally, and if you had to draw, you wouldn't have drawn this diagram, but if you had to draw Reed-Kellogg diagrams that we were talking about before, you would put had lost in one section of the diagram, right? They would just be run together. But those are actually, they're two separate words. So if we translate that way of thinking about it into a diagram, you would get something like this. So what we're saying here is that the predicate consists of a MV, main verb, which breaks down into two parts, the auxiliary has and the verb lost. And then we've got the direct object, the diamond ring. That's a traditional view. However, if we start to ask ourselves what kind of constituent is has lost, which is clearly two words, right? It gets kind of tricky. So notice this. Julia's sister has lost her diamond ring. Okay, ordinary sentence. Let's play around with the order. Question, has Julia's sister lost her diamond ring? So notice, has moves separately from lost when we form a question, right? We can also use a series of things. Bonk! How's it going, Ryan? How about the Raiders? How you doing? Still playing Witcher. Thank you for that shout out, Bins. No worries. No worries. We are actually probably 15 minutes or so before I'm about to wrap up. Yeah, everything's been going pretty well. Having fun with Witcher, I hope. That's great. It's on my to play list eventually. So what we're looking at, for those of you who just joined us, is the structure of sort of these complex verb phrases that have multiple things in them, right? So has lost, things like that. Yeah, I'm sure I'll like Witcher Bunk. I mean, I spent way too many hours back in the day playing Skyrim, so I think Witcher's right up my alley. Notice with these examples, right? Has moves independently from lost. Separate word. It is Julia's sister who has lost. So we can move that kind of sentence is called a cleft sentence. What we're doing is we're taking one phrase and moving it and putting it in between like the it is and the who, right? It is her diamond ring that Julia's sister has lost. So we can move those constituents. If it's a single constituent, like Julia's sister or her diamond ring, we can stick it in that spot in this kind of sentence. But notice we can't do that with has lost. It is has lost that Julia's sister her diamond ring, right? What Julia's sister has lost is her diamond ring. So Julia's sister has lost is a unit that we can move, right? What Julia's sister has done is lost her diamond ring. So we can move, like the has done part together, has and then the do verb. But or lost her diamond ring is what Julia's sister has done. So again, lost moves separately from has, right? A loose unit. It's a good way to put it, Benz. But notice has lost is what Julia's sister did her diamond ring. No, makes no sense at all. Has lost her diamond ring is what Julia's sister did. In other words, when you try to move has lost by itself or has lost her diamond ring as a single unit, it doesn't work, right? If it were a single unit, you could move it, but you can't. Also, then the final example shows like you can use coordination between lost her has and then the two things here, lost her diamond ring and filed an insurance claim. So they're coordinated. All of this suggests that this pattern that we were looking at back here is nonsense, right? Has lost is two words in a row, but it's not a phrase. It's not any kind of constituent at all. So instead, what's happening here is what we have is a verb, the auxiliary verb, which has as its complement another verb phrase, right? So notice if we just look at lost her diamond ring, that looks exactly like if we just said Julia's sister lost her diamond ring, that looks exactly like a normal sentence that we're familiar with. It is a normal sentence, right? Just ordinary verb, direct object, right? When we add has, all we're really doing is we're sticking an extra layer in the phrase structure, right? So the auxiliary verb has a verb phrase as a complement. And this is one of the characteristic things when we talk about something being an auxiliary verb, right? What we mean is like one of the basic things about auxiliary verbs is instead of having like a noun phrase or an adjective phrase as a complement, which we saw for the regular verbs, they take other verb phrases as complements. Okay. All right. I did not have time to actually write up the homework for this time yet. So we'll have to do that and probably post it tomorrow morning. Does anybody have any questions or observations of anything? I hope my goal today was in part to mess with you about tense. If I can leave people coming away from this talk a little bit blown away by how the stuff they thought they knew wasn't actually accurate, then I have succeeded. So. All right. What do we have here? Excellent, Walter. Glad to help. Yeah. So to recap just quickly, remember, English has two primary tenses, present and past. The future in English is a time reference, not a separate tense. So will is, in a technical sense, a present tense verb, and as such, we see it appear with other present tense verbs, right? Even though it characteristically refers to future time, right? The progressive is action in progress. It's formed with to be plus the ing form of the verb, the progressive participle, right? And then you combine tense and the progressive, so present progressive, past progressive, right? Then you have the perfect, same idea. That one's have plus the past participle, right? So I have gone, we have worked, etc., right? Again, the tense on the first verb combines with the later stuff, and then you can stack everything else, right? So, yeah, that's how all of that works. Okay. I'm glad everybody enjoyed it. Okay. Who should we raid?